And I now call Adam Corlett, who's moving Amendment 1.
Conference. I fully support this motion, but have proposed Amendment 1 to ensure we're not ignoring a key issue in this debate. There are many areas that we wouldn't describe as drug policy, but that nonetheless have a huge bearing on drug use. Of course, it is essential that we get drug laws right and our treatment options right. And I think this motion would be a great step forward in doing this. But it's also essential that we tackle the social and economic circumstances that impact on drug use. And this amendment makes clear that Liberal Democrats, at least, will never forget this. For example, if the government and communities fail to prevent or respond to the abuse of children at home, they are leaving the door open for drug addiction when these young people grow up with their emotional health issues unresolved. And the classification of cannabis, be that Class B or Class C, is unlikely to make the difference between a young person deciding to use it or not. But being permanently out of work with nothing to do all day, that has a big impact. If we provide people with opportunities, prosperity, engagement in society, that is all more likely to keep people off drugs than threatening them with punishment. It's also a good approach for keeping people out of the drugs trade and ensuring that dealing drugs is not the best opportunity that people are given. I'd also like to speak briefly about the motion as a whole. It is not so much about shaping long-term policy, rather it is about saying we are in government now, we should be acting now. Many MPs and even ministers seem to be more averse to drug policy than to drugs themselves, but the impact assessment this motion calls for is not unreasonable. These reviews are indeed standard for modern legislation, and it is more important than ever to ensure that no public money or resources are being wasted. Conference, I urge you to support Amendment 1 and the motion, and I urge our MPs to act on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Could Julian Cooper please stand by? And I now call Prateek Buch, who's moving Amendment 2.
Thank you, Chair. Afternoon, Conference. Allow me first to congratulate and thank Ewan for not only for that passionate speech, but for moving an outstanding motion. Now, in moving this amendment, I, like Adam before me, seek to strengthen it in terms of what I see as its standout quality, which is the centrality of reliable scientific advice delivered independently from the political arena in setting drugs policy. Now, this motion is distinct right from the outset because it acknowledges that alongside the undoubted evidence for health-related, economic and societal harms that drug use can cause, there is evidence that the policies historically in place to tackle those harms are themselves problematic, that many of the adverse impacts drugs have on our communities are down to the way current drugs law is formulated. So where do we get that evidence of harm from? Well, in an ideal world, you'd get it from independent clinicians, scientists, social scientists who dedicate their professional lives to studying how drugs work, how best to limit their use, how best to control the harms they cause. But sadly, drugs policy, as Ewan's mentioned, is far too often based more on moralising ideology or on appeasing tabloid headline writers, frankly, than on robust scientific evidence. I'm sure that you will recall the low point in the way that government treats scientific advice with the dismissal, the shameful dismissal of Professor David Nutt, who at the time was the government's chief advisor on drugs as head of the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs. This exemplified the contempt that the previous Labour administration had for scientific evidence. But the relationship between government and its scientific advisors wasn't soured over the mistreatment of just one expert on one occasion. There was a systematic sidelining of independent scientific advice, most prominently over drugs, yes, but in other areas as well. That's what motivated this amendment today. Now, the motion, as we've heard, calls for an independent impact assessment of the current drugs law policy, and for several reforms to current law to be implemented. Without robust scientific insight, how will we ever be sure that the policies that are implemented with the best of intentions are working at all? How can we ever be confident in that inquiry's verdict? It's only the very best clinicians, scientists and social scientists that can make such a judgment, not because they're in a position of authority, that they're experts, but rather they are able to describe the data from reliable studies without fear of being ignored or silenced should said data not fit with prevailing attitudes or prejudices. So today, conference, by passing this motion, we have the opportunity to show communities across the world that are blighted by the harms caused by drugs and the failed war on drugs that sets out to prevent those harms, that we are serious about tackling these issues through a balanced, evidence-based approach. We have a further opportunity by passing the amendment for Lib Dems to make a clear statement that instead of discarding scientific evidence the minute it appears inconvenient or to contradict the prejudices of a fear-mongering press, we will place reliable, independent scientific advice at the heart of our policy-making process, especially when it comes to protecting individuals and communities from the harms caused by drugs. Please support the amendment and Adams as well, and the motion as a whole. Thank you.